Talk of civil war is all the rage these days, but I do not believe that a civil conflict in the United States is likely to happen, and I shall explain why right now. So, my friends, unfortunately, over the past few days and over the past few years, as of the posting of this video, there have been a lot of talk about the possibility of civil war arising within the borders of the United States. Indeed, a speech that Joe Biden recently made before his horrid Independence Hall speech, he said that Americans who want to challenge the government will need F-15s or whatever other instrument to actually effectively challenge the government. Into the Independence Hall speech, many people said that there is civil war imminent or Biden is pushing civil war. The George Floyd riots of 2020 and what we saw happen in Portland and over in Seattle with Antifa-related activities such as the Seattle Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, where they illegally took a certain area of the city from people and declared it an autonomous zone to the subservience of the police and the mayor. All of these different events have people saying civil war is imminent. According to Business Insider, 43% of Americans actually believe in the next 10 years civil war will likely happen in some way, shape, or form. And many of you probably know pretty popular content creators who always use the word civil war in their content. I'm not naming names. I'm just stating it how it is. But, I've examined these arguments and I have examined the case, and I'm not convinced. But I also understand that the haze, the fog of political conflict has the tendency to affect the conclusions that all of us make, and I want to be sympathetic to that. But with that in mind, I want to give all of you a few reasons as to why I do not believe a civil war is likely to happen in America anytime soon, at least, based on the current conditions of our country. Now, there are two ways that people who promote the idea of civil war going to happen like to argue. They like to use two different things. Number one, political division. They like to say that political division is so big, so great, that there may be irreconcilable differences that different factions in America won't be able to fix. Ergo, it will end and result in civil war. Then they'll say that economic catastrophe is nigh, and that will result in civil war. These are the two main popular arguments. There are plenty of more arguments for civil war. I'm not going to address them in this video. And also, this video is not meant to address the claims of what we would call accelerationists. There are some people in America that actually want a civil conflict to happen because they believe in secession. I'm not going to make a comment on those people. I will deal with them in a different video because there are some interesting claims there, and I don't want to be dismissive, but they are outside of the scope of this project. The project here is to analyze claims of why civil war might happen and then pose a counterclaim that it won't happen. And so when political division, let's start with the first reason, political division. When I hear the word political division, my mind immediately jumps back to the annals of American history, and I think to myself, America has always been divided. People know this. Anyone who has even an elementary understanding of American history knows this. But this truth is not sufficient to beat back fears of civil war. And I understand why, because we're not living in past American history. We're living in current American history, and so a lot of us are looking at what we have in front of us and then interpreting that for what it is. However, I think taking a stroll back through American history might actually help us understand some of these things. Now, there are two ways that people like to approach the topic of civil war. Like to approach it through possibility and approach it through probability. So people say, well, civil war is possible. So I'm going to reject from the offset the possibility of civil war. Anything is possible. It's possible that on a semi-cloudy day, I could walk outside and get hit by a thunderbolt from Zeus, and I could get fried. That's possible. But is it probable? The thing is, possibility has such a wide spectrum of things that it becomes almost useless to try to see what is possible. We should instead in life govern ourselves by what is probable. You are more probable to get robbed in a neighborhood with a high crime rate, and so you should proceed in caution in that neighborhood. Whereas if you're in the wilderness, in the middle of Omaha, or in the middle of Nebraska in general, you probably wouldn't have to have the same considerations that you have in an urban city. Probability, not possibility. With that said, let's examine some of the divisions throughout American history that kind of demonstrate why this Civil War claim is a little bit silly. So one of the first divisions I want to look at is the Shays Rebellion. So this is right before the Constitution was ratified. This is in 1786. The Constitution came about in 1787. And in Shays' Rebellion, essentially, there were farmers in Massachusetts who had a lot of debts and couldn't repay them because of the sour state of the economy at that point. And they were also getting taxed by the state as well at very high levels. And so a lot of their property was repossessed. A lot of people went to prison for not paying their taxes, so on and so forth. And so Daniel Shays, who was a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, who couldn't get paid from the Continental Army that he fought in for America, also had a lot of debts, and he suffered the same pain that the farmers did. So what did he do? He formed a group of people, farmers and people who just had debts in general, and he went and he fought, and he went to an armory, and they got violent. There was gunfire exchanged. The government won. Shays fled. A lot of people who helped him were arrested, but many people were pardoned, and many people were also forgiven, but some people were publicly executed as well. Well, this event is important for two reasons. Number one, this event motivated the people at the Constitutional Convention in their thinking about the new nation, about the Constitution. And this event also motivated George Washington to go into public life. Thomas Jefferson said of this event that the tree of liberty requires the blood of patriots and tyrants to be refreshed and renewed. This is going to be a very important point in a few moments when I get to this kind of thinking when we have these kind of events, but just notice that. And so that was a big thing that happened right before our Constitution was established. Then right after our Constitution was established, when Washington was president, one of the first challenges he faced was the Whiskey Rebellion, where there were people in Pennsylvania that were getting taxed on their whiskey, and really this was a tax that was across the entire nation, and it had many different forms, but it was an excise tax on whiskey, because whiskey was actually a form of exchange in many areas of the country, and it was a way that people used to just, as a point of sociability as well. So the whiskey was taxed, and the George Washington's political party, the Federalist Party, which was also the party of Alexander Hamilton, they supported such measures. And there were a lot of people in America who didn't support such measures because they had literally just fought a war or had witnessed a war, had supported a war that was over taxes, that was over more than taxes, was over taxes and over a bunch of other things. So naturally, the idea of getting taxed on whiskey when people literally overthrew the past government being taxed on tea wasn't something that people wanted to deal with. So there was a lot of anger. There were people that went from door to door of every tax agent, every tax collector, and who terrorized them. There were people who tarred and feathered them, who humiliated them, who stripped them naked and put stuff on them. And it got so bad that Washington had to come into Pennsylvania with his militia and put down the armed rebellions that had arose as a result of the Whiskey Revolution, as a result of the Whiskey Uprising. Now, a lot of the people who fought, they didn't show up, and the trouble was dispersed. But after that, the government literally couldn't enforce the whiskey tax. And so eventually, under Jefferson's administration, the whiskey tax was repealed. Why did I bring up these two examples? Because you had one event at the very formation of the nation, which could have broken apart America's ability to come together, which was a widespread condition amongst a lot of people, the debts. Then you have another event after the Constitution was established, which tested the strength of the centralized government and eventually showed that people in a non-violent capacity can act as a veto against a centralized government if they exert their will against them for a just cause. And those two things, which had violence involved in them, did not lead to civil war. In fact, it led to transformation. The Shays Rebellion led to the Constitution, or it had a big role into it. The Whiskey Rebellion led to the repeal of that tax and an emphasis on federalism and states' rights that came under the Jeffersonian presidency. Transformation came out of conflict. This will be important in a few moments. Now, The American Civil War, I'll be very short here because I don't want to go too long on this. The American Civil War is oftentimes looked at as a precursor or as a good example of what a future war could look like. The American Civil War is not sufficient, nor is it well, for predicting future events for several reasons. Number one, it occurred during a period of American history when America was still trying to find out who it was. It was still trying to find out what its identity was. And not only that, but there were still parts of the country, broad swaths, that still didn't have states. In fact, even in 1850, the states of Utah and so on were formed from compromises, the Compromise of 1850. In California, and up until 1850, was not even a state in the country. So this was still a forming puzzle, America was, that was still trying to get its act together. Now you have that for the sort of growing pains of being a new nation, because the revolution was not even 100 years old. The foundation of the country was only a few decades old at that point. So you have that. Then you have the conversation around states' rights. Then you have the conversation around slavery and property and so many other things, which eventually bubbled up into what will become the Civil War. But these all were foundational issues. These were not issues that were transient and light, as the Constitution says, political causes. These were not just your average everyday, oh, the ANTIFA people are doing this again. No, these were issues concerning what kind of country do we want to be a few decades after we have just shed blood to break the yoke of a monarchy. These were very serious, deep issues. And yes, these led to a civil war, but given the uniqueness of the time period that the Civil War happened in, it is not sufficient to use that to predict future conflicts, especially in a time where America has a much better idea of what it is and what it wants to be than it did in 1850, a few decades after the Constitution had been signed, ratified, and put into law. Now, after the Civil War, there was a huge anti-immigrant sentiment that came in America against Italians, against Irish, against a lot of different ethnic groups. And these sentiments translated into violence a lot. In New Orleans in 1891, there was a lynching of 11 Italian citizens who were accused of murdering a police officer, and the lynching actually included some of the citizens who were acquitted. The mobs lynched them. And then in 1871, in New York City, there were the Orange Riots. Now, this is just after the American Civil War. There were the Orange Riots where Italian citizens, not Italians, Irish citizens, Irish Catholics, and other people, they got involved in this brawl, in this ethnic conflict on American soil, and it devolved into gunfire, death, gore, all kind of things. These ethnic conflicts, which were far more numerous than the two examples I just gave you, did not lead to civil war. In the case of the Orange Riots, it actually led to the destruction of one of the greatest corruption pits in American history, Tammany Hall, and it transformed the dynamic of politics in America. Again, transformation coming out of conflict. This is an important theme we have to understand. All right, but let's go over to perhaps some of the most goriest conflicts on this list, and that is the Red Summer. So, in 1919, for a period of time, there were a series of race riots which broke out all across America. And is estimated to be around 25, 26, although I have seen sources that have put them way beyond that. And in these race riots, there were people who were lynched, businesses were burnt down, there were armed rebellions from African Americans against lynch mobs. Police officers and mayors were killed and lynched. There were a lot of things happening, and all of it was civil concept. Black people were stoned. And in fact, let me read to you some of the most gruesome examples from the Red Summer of 1919. In Chicago, there were 38 fatalities, 537 people injured, and 1,000 black families made homeless. And there were 7 continuous days of shootings, beatings, and arson done by lynch mobs who were mad and who were incited to rage by various different things that had happened. In Elaine, Arkansas, between 100 to 200 people were killed by government soldiers in a government pogrom sent forth by a racist politician. In Omaha, Nebraska, 10,000 people stormed the courthouse looking for a wrongly accused black prisoner. And when they weren't allowed to get to him, they tried to kill the mayor of Omaha. They tried to kill police officers. They destroyed the courthouse. They burnt down the courthouse. They dragged the black man out. They dismembered him. I'm sorry for being graphic, but I had to say this. They dismembered him. They lynched him. Then they attached his body to a car, drove the car across the damn street into the black neighborhood, and stood there and grinned. 10,000 people. This happened. This is one of many events that happened in 1919 within a few months. These events make the George Floyd riots look like a child's play. And all of this occurred during the Red Scare, during a period where America was at a heightened awareness about communism and Bolshevism. And a lot of these events were actually attributed to Bolshevism as opposed to being dealt with in their proper way for what they actually were, because politicians at this time were trying to use these events for their own political gain. What am I saying? Oh, also, I could go to the 60s as well. Look at the Vietnam War protest and the riots the Pentagon riot of the 70s, which were thousands of people who got into Washington, a few hundred who broke off, stormed the Pentagon, and who were arrested. That was about, I gotta talk to you about Kent State University, where a bunch of innocent college kids were killed by the military. That was about, I gotta talk to you about the 60s protests where civil rights activists were bitten by dogs and hosed down. Civil conflict has been part and parcel for this country for as long as any historian who's measured history can remember. And I must ask every person who believes in civil war this: do you believe America is in the same place that it was when Shays' Rebellion happened, when the Whiskey Rebellion happened, when the anti-immigrant attacks of the late 1870s, the late 19th century happened, when the Red Summer happened, when 1960s riots and all that kind of stuff happened? Do you believe America is in the same place that it was during these volatile years? To me, it is obvious that it is not. Is there division? Yes. Is there chaos sometimes? Yes. But a lot of this is self-contained to smaller areas, and a lot of this only occurs because in the case of Antifa, the police don't do their jobs. The police and the politicians are motivated by political ideology, and they're captured by the ideology, and their ideology prevents them from actually doing their jobs. That's why militia groups like Antifa are allowed to roam free. In Georgia, when Antifa showed up at a small town, Noonan, which I've been to many times, and they refused to take down their masks because there was an anti-mask law in Georgia that was instituted a long time ago to fight the Klan. The police arrested Antifa, and that was not a riot, wasn't a skirmish. It was nothing because the police did their job. My friends, political division is not a precursor always to war or to war. Political division, and all of these cases that I've mentioned, in Shays' Rebellion, in the Whiskey Rebellion, in the immigrant issues, in 1919, in the 60s, all of them were precursors to transformation. After each of these events, society was transformed into something different. Society was transformed, whether it be on a small scale or a larger scale, and this transformation is endemic to what human beings are and what we do. The idea that there will be this civil war that happens, and because conflict is always a precursor to more and a larger scale conflict, is dead-end thinking. It rejects the power of the human spirit and uses anecdotal instances that have happened around you to form a broader conclusion, when in all reality, we have a society that has been trending towards cultural pluralism for the past 50 or some odd years. We have a society which is okay now with interracial marriage. We have a society that is okay with people of different religious backgrounds and people of different ethnic backgrounds coming here. We have a society in which all these things, which 50 years ago would have caused civil conflict, are no longer powder kegs for civil conflict. And yet, people are going to let political divisions, which have always been here, be a precursor to some long, drawn-out war without establishing why and without considering the probability as such. History tells us that these conflicts can go many different ways. And in a country where there are over 100 million verified voters who do not want anything to do with politics, who statistically do not understand politics, who don't care to understand politics, you're expecting me to believe that there's enough grounds to have a widespread civil conflict. If by civil war you mean a fighting between two or three small groups, that already happens. This happened in Charlottesville, happened in Portland, happened across the country during the illicit riots that burnt down half America. It happens. That's not civil war. War is a systematic, long carried out approach to destroying an enemy. And that, as history has shown us, is not the likely outcome of so many different events. Now, the economic argument is this. Economic catastrophe leads to civil war, or it might. Well, first of all, there have been over 48 recessions in American history. And of all those recessions, not one of them led to civil war. Led to shortages, led to famine, drought, all kind of things, but not to civil war. You would have to make a convincing argument that mere recession leads to civil war. It can possibly lead to unrest, but all of this stuff is possibly. We have to look at what we have in front of us and then consider that throughout the entire history of the United States, up until the post-war era, the dollar has not been so dominant, America has not been such a dominant economic force, to the point where a lot of the world still relies on America to do its business. America is now in a globalized economy, which would even further stave off the possibility of economic collapse even lasting for a very long time, much less creating a war. Now, I'll say this much. It is very possible that a collapse could trigger unrest. I'm not naive. And it's also very possible that the dollar may not be around for a very long time. I'm also not naive in that respect. The dollar is held up by a fragile apparatus, the full faith and credit of the creditors, and it is constantly perverted, bastardized, and stretched thin by politicians who don't understand fiscal restraint. So I'm not trying to argue those things, but I'm trying to say this. The probability of that happening is not very high. Now, to tie this all up, the reason why people think there's going to be a civil war, as I mentioned, is mostly for political division purposes. But political division is not only part and parcel to American history. Political division also belongs to the political principles that America was built upon, the principles of classical liberalism. My friends, the conflict and division is a problem of classical liberalism. It is the liberal paradox. We have a society which touts the virtues of free speech and toleration, and at the same point, there are people within that society that don't tolerate each other. So how can a society like this actually survive? This is what people who have been working on the issue of classical liberalism and political theory have been trying to find out for a very, very long time. And it's a very difficult question, but I think I have an answer. The liberal society survives because it allows dissent, because dissent and division are actually good things. Division, if nothing in this world was divided, we wouldn't understand it. If there was not darkness, we wouldn't have a correct account of light. If there was not evil, we wouldn't have a correct account of good. There is an opposite to everything in this world, and that exists by virtue of division. We understand what a body without water is and what happens to it, as opposed to a body that has water in it constantly because the human body needs water. We can divide those two things and understand. If we didn't have division, we wouldn't have anything. We wouldn't have life. Life requires division, especially human life, because all of us have different skills. Again, division. So it would make sense for political division to also exist. If life is divided, if reality is divided, then a subset of reality, of life, is politics. That should also be divided. That should make sense. But also, dissent is good because dissent allows us to divide certain points apart and consider them for what they are, and it can also allow us to get to the truth faster, or in a better way than crushing dissent would. When you crush dissent, you have no effective mechanism to achieve truthful outcomes about certain things. Liberalism understands this, which is why it allows these things. But we have to constrain these things within the rule of law, within proper boundaries, so it doesn't spiral out of control. But these things, division is not a curse, it is not a sign of catastrophe. Division, if used properly, is actually a sign of a productive and healthy society that is engaging with the very essence of the human spirit. So my friends, I'll leave you with this. Don't be afraid of civil war. What you should be afraid of is pessimism and pessimistic outcomes, which are born from a perspective that cannot pierce the fog of war, that cannot pierce the fog of political conflict. There's a world outside of politics, and there's a lot of people in that world who are mystified by this entire thing. And even within politics, there are people within politics who have families, who have communities that they love, and who don't want to get involved in armed conflict. And the very few that do can be handled. And you should be more concerned about a government that does not want to handle people who want to instigate conflict, a government that itself is also trying to instigate conflict. You should be worried about that. That is a far bigger threat than a civil war ever will be. The problems of liberalism are problems, but they're not irreconcilable differences. And I believe that we all live in a better society for them. All right, my friends. Thank you guys so much. I love you guys so much. If you love me, please be sure to go to my Patreon, patreon.com/officialcwatson, or my PayPal, officialcwatch@gmail.com. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video, comment on this video. My friends, I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.